The gun fired 3 times. On the morning of July 10th, 1923, in the carpeted corridor of the Savoy Hotel, a woman stood holding a pistol while her husband lay dying on the floor beside her. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, sharp, chemical, entirely wrong for a place this expensive, and her silk dress caught the light from the corridor sconces the way expensive things do, indifferent to context. The staff who arrived first would later say she looked completely still. The kind of still that isn't shock. The kind that comes after a person has already finished something and is simply waiting for the world to register it. That woman was Marguerite Alibert, and what she had finished didn't begin that morning. It had begun 40 years earlier, in a Paris apartment where the steam from the washing pot stuck to the single window, and the wool her mother laundered scratched her skin raw by February, and every morning survival cost something new. Paris in the late 1800s was not a city of romance for the poor. It was a ledger. You tallied what you had, what you owed, and how quickly the gap between those two columns was going to close around you. Marguerite Alibert grew up negotiating those costs before she could read. Her mother was a laundress. Her father was mostly absent. In her one-room apartment in the 10th arrondissement, life, work, and sleep all happened in the same cramped space, and the street outside was loud with the particular noise that poverty makes. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just constant, and never telling you anything useful. But Marguerite had something the other girls in her building didn't. She watched people, not the way children watch, out of boredom or idle curiosity. She watched the way a seamstress watches fabric, looking for the grain, the give, the place where it would tear if you pulled wrong. She was cataloging weaknesses before she even had a name for them. She was mapping exits before she understood she was trapped. By the time she was 15, she understood something that most women of her era spent their whole lives pretending wasn't true, that beauty was a currency, and she had been issued a great deal of it, and she intended to spend every last centime before it depreciated. She entered the demi-monde, that half-world of Paris suspended between respectable society and the criminal underclass, not as a victim dragged under by circumstance, but as a deliberate act of self-preservation. She became a courtesan, and she was extraordinary at it. The women who succeeded in that world weren't simply beautiful. Beauty was the entry fee. Everyone at the table had already paid it. What separated the ones who merely survived from the ones who built something durable was the ability to make a man feel like the most singular creature in any room while simultaneously measuring the distance between where you stood and where you needed to be. Marguerite could do this so naturally that the men she cultivated rarely noticed they were being read. They thought they had found a woman who truly understood them. What they had found was a woman who understood exactly what understanding them was worth. By her early 20s, she had accumulated a small fortune, a wardrobe that would have impressed a duchess, and a roster of clients that read like a seating chart for a state dinner. She spoke multiple languages. She had taught herself to move through aristocratic spaces with a sureness that bore no fingerprints of where it came from. The scratch of wet wool didn't follow her into the salons of the 8th. She had outpaced those winters through grinding determination alone. And here is the thing about women who teach themselves to survive in rooms that were never designed for them. They develop a kind of attentiveness that never fully rests. They learn to read the temperature of a conversation several exchanges before it turns dangerous. They learn which silences are comfortable and which ones are gathering force. Marguerite had been operating this way since childhood, and by her late 20s, it was so thoroughly woven into how she moved through the world that it had become indistinguishable from instinct. Paris during the First World War was a city holding its breath. The men were gone, or coming back altered in ways nobody had language for yet, and the women who had built lives around the social rituals of peacetime were navigating a landscape where the old rules were technically still in force, but nobody had the resources to police them. For someone like Marguerite, this was not a crisis. It was an opening. And then, sometime around 1917, she met the prince. Edward, Prince of Wales, was 23 years old, charming in the loose, unearned way of men who have never needed to work for a room's attention, and bored with a depth that his rank made structurally unavoidable. He had been positioned near the front in a ceremonial capacity, close enough to the war to photograph with dignity, far enough from actual combat that the crown wasn't risking the succession. He hated the performance of it. He was 23, restless, and quietly aware that the life laid out for him was a kind of gilded constraint. Every path mapped, every choice pre-approved, every room already arranged before he walked into it. Marguerite was 32. She viewed his privilege with the detached familiarity of someone who had spent years reading exactly this type of man, the one who had never once been told no by anything that mattered, and who had therefore never learned what he actually was without the scaffolding of his position holding him up. She knew how that kind of man crumbled when the scaffolding finally came down. Their affair was, by the accounts of those who moved in those circles, genuine on both sides. He was captivated by her in the way that carefully insulated men are often captivated by women who have actually lived, not performing experience, but carrying it in every measured word, every unhurried response. She listened to him in a way the people paid to listen to him couldn't manage. She had no report to file afterward, no image to protect on his behalf. She was simply there, fully present, and for a young man surrounded by people who were always partially somewhere else, that was more intoxicating than anything his position could manufacture. She was captivated by him too, and the part of her that never stopped balancing the accounts was also noting, with absolute precision, what she was accumulating. Because Edward wrote to her letters, constantly. The kind of letters a besotted young man writes when he is far from the woman he wants and cannot sleep, and the war has made ordinary caution feel beside the point, and he has forgotten, or chosen not to care. That paper outlasts feeling by decades. A future king of England was sending intimate letters to a woman who would one day stand in a dock charged with murder. He never asked for them back. The letters were unguarded. They were intimate. While they were never made public, and their exact contents remain unconfirmed to this day, what historians like Andrew Rose have pieced together suggests they were explicit enough, naive enough, personally revealing enough, that in the wrong hands they represented not merely scandal, but a crisis of legitimacy. A king-to-be, in documented correspondence with a woman whose past could not survive the light of a courtroom. The connection alone was sufficient to set an institution on fire. Marguerite kept every one. She kept them the way you keep a deed to property in a country you might someday need to flee to. Not because you're planning the escape, not because you think about it every day, but because the deed exists and its existence changes what you are allowed to feel safe about. She didn't wave them around. She didn't mention them. She simply knew they were there, folded somewhere private, and that knowledge altered the weight of every room she entered. The affair ended, as such things do. Edward moved on. And here is where most histories lose the thread. They follow Marguerite as she traveled and moved through society as though the years between the prince and Ali Fahmy were simply quiet ones. They were not quiet. They were years defined by a dangerous calculation that never stopped running. Every time a knock came at the door of her salon, she had to weigh it, a client or a man sent by the palace to retrieve the prince's mistakes. Every new acquaintance had to be assessed not just for what they wanted from her, but for who might have sent them. She was not simply moving through European high society in those years. She was moving through it as someone carrying material that the most powerful institution in England would have found reasons to want destroyed, and who understood, with absolute clarity, that the moment she became more trouble than she was worth, her protection evaporated completely. The letters kept her safe. The letters also kept her in permanent, quiet danger. That tension never left her. Then, In 1919, she made the biggest mistake of her life. She met Ali Camel Bey. He was 22 years old, Egyptian, and wealthy in the way that makes wealth itself invisible. You don't notice the money because every surface around it is simply correct, every silence the right length, every room already at the temperature it should be. He had been educated in Paris and wore European manners like a tailored suit, perfectly fitted in public, removed the moment the door closed. Because behind the Parisian education was a man who had very fixed ideas about what a wife was, and none of those ideas had anything to do with the woman Marguerite Alibert had spent 34 years constructing herself into being. He pursued her with the steady, pressurized certainty of someone who had never been told no by anything that mattered. He sent gifts at a scale that startled even her. He was persistent with the patience of water against stone, constant and utterly confident in the eventual outcome. She weighed it the way she weighed everything. The window in which a woman of her background could sustain her position through intelligence and maintain social capital was not without limits. Real security, the kind that didn't depend on your continued ability to charm a room, was the one thing she had never fully manufactured for herself. In 1923, she married him. What followed was not what she had agreed to. It never announced itself as a trap. It assembled itself in increments, each restriction small enough to seem manageable in isolation, the full picture only becoming visible when she looked back and realized she could no longer recognize the shape of her own days. He started noticing how much she spent on bread. He demanded to know why she had returned 5 minutes late from a walk she took alone. He controlled the finances with a thoroughness that transformed a woman who had managed her own affairs since adolescence into someone who had to justify a cab fare. He demanded she convert to Islam, which she did, formally, taking the name Munira, and then used religious custom as a set of walls she hadn't understood she was agreeing to and couldn't now refuse without consequence. And he hurt her, in ways that the defense would later frame in court as claims, presented carefully as a legal strategy within its historical context, but which she described with the specific, unadorned detail of someone who had lived through them rather than invented them. He hurt her in ways that didn't always leave marks where the world could see, and in ways that sometimes did, and in ways that communicated, each time, exactly who held the terms of this arrangement. She had spent her entire life engineering exits. She had married a man whose resources were sufficient to close every one she had ever learned to open. On the night of July 9th, 1923, they attended a party at the Egyptian embassy in London. The argument that began there was witnessed, noted by people who would later be asked to describe it in court. They returned to their suite at the Savoy sometime past midnight, and the argument continued behind a closed door. What was said, in which language, at what volume, none of it is recoverable. What followed it is 3 shots, then silence. The house detective who reached the corridor found Ali Fahmy on the floor. Marguerite stood a few feet away, the pistol still in her hand. She said something in French, "Tu as fait?" And some who heard it described a cry of genuine regret. Others, watching her face in that moment, saw a woman delivering the first line of a carefully rehearsed performance. Her expression, every account agrees, gave nothing away. It offered no clue as to which version was the truth. Ali Fahmy Bey died at Charing Cross Hospital in the early hours of July 10, 1923. He was 23 years old. Marguerite was charged with murder. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in September 1923, and the city lost its composure completely. Every morning the public galleries filled before the doors opened. Newspapers dedicated their front pages to daily transcripts. Women queued outside before dawn. London had not been handed a story this precisely constructed for mass consumption in years. A French courtesan, a dead Egyptian aristocrat, a luxury hotel suite, a smoking pistol, a marriage the defense promised to describe as captivity. The heat inside that courtroom was the kind that makes everything feel slightly unreal, slightly too loud, slightly brighter than it should be. At the center of the defense was Sir Edward Marshall Hall. Marshall Hall was the most celebrated criminal barrister of his generation. He was tall, physically commanding, with a face that projected the particular kind of trustworthiness that cannot be manufactured, and a voice that could move between quiet reason and devastating indignation without a seam showing. He understood juries the way a conductor understands an orchestra. Not just what the notes said, but what the silences between them did to a room full of people who wanted to feel something. He had brought people back from the gallows on evidence considerably thinner than this. The evidence was not good. 3 shots, a witnessed argument, her pistol, a prosecutor who was competent, methodical, and not interested in theater. Marshall Hall built 2 pillars and balanced everything on them. The first was the marriage. Marshall Hall played on the xenophobia of the era, painting a portrait of the Eastern tyrant that he knew the jury was already primed to believe. A cruel, controlling man whose treatment of his wife was framed as the natural product of a culture the jury had been conditioned to distrust. He made clear, for the record, that he was presenting the defense's case as argued in 1923, but he used those prejudices anyway, because he understood that 12 people in that room were not going to reach a verdict through logic alone. He needed them to feel something first. He then walked to the evidence table, picked up the pistol, and pointed it directly at the jury box. The gallery gasped. A woman in the front row flinched backward. The judge's reprimand cracked across the room. And then came the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a courtroom at rest, but the dense, pressurized silence of a room full of people who have just had a gun leveled at them and are now being asked to sit very still and process what that feels like in their chest. Marshall Hall let that silence sit. He did not move to fill it. He understood that what the jury was experiencing in that moment, the involuntary tightening, the instinct to create distance between themselves and the barrel, was the entire argument. He had made them feel, for 3 seconds, what Marguerite claimed she had felt for months inside that marriage. Then he lowered the weapon and waited for the silence to finish its work. The second pillar was the shooting itself. He argued that Marguerite had not made a decision in that hotel room. She had picked up the pistol in the dark, in terror, intending only to create distance between herself and a man whose intentions she had every reason to fear. And it had gone off. Then gone off again. Then again. The body refusing to be destroyed without a fight. What Marshall Hall never mentioned, what nobody in that courtroom mentioned, what the prosecution never approached, were the letters. Because sometime before the trial reached its most dangerous questions, something had happened in the quiet. Not written down, not attributable. A conversation in the right room between the right people, in the efficient, unhurried register of institutions that have been protecting themselves for centuries. The letters existed. Their potential consequences were understood by those who needed to understand them. And those people had concluded, with the speed of long practice, that the letters could not become part of any public proceeding. The Crown prosecutor did not pursue the lines of inquiry that would have led there. The witnesses who might have known were not called. The defense did not raise it. There was no reason to raise what was already understood. While the letters themselves never surfaced, the sudden withdrawal of the prosecution's aggression at precisely the moments when Marguerite's history with the Crown might have become relevant suggests, strongly, that a deal was struck somewhere the record cannot reach. Marshall Hall delivered his closing on September 14, 1923. He spoke about the darkness of that hotel suite, about the weight of being alone with a man whose intentions you have every reason to fear, about what the body does when every option has been exhausted. He held up the pistol one final time. He let the silence in the room do the rest of the work. The jury was out for less than an hour. Not guilty. The courtroom broke open. People stood. Some wept. Marguerite received the verdict with a remote stillness, not the blankness of someone overwhelmed, but the careful release of someone who had held a great deal of tension for a very long time and was only now, quietly, setting it down. Like a person who has been carrying something heavy across a long distance and finally, at the destination, simply opens their hands. She walked out of the Old Bailey on September 15, 1923, into pale London light and kept walking. She married again, a French industrialist, respectable and uncomplicated. She settled into a comfortable later life in France. She declined every journalist who came looking completely and without explanation. She had nothing to say. She had never had anything to say. When Edward abdicated in December 1936, the world saw a man giving up a throne for love. Marguerite, living quietly in France, saw something else. The man whose secrets had once been her only shield finally walking away from the very institution that had protected them both. Whatever that meant to her, relief, or the particular loneliness of watching your last leverage dissolve, she kept that too. She kept everything. Marguerite Alibert died in Paris in 1971, 84 years old. Whatever she knew, the exact words Edward had committed to paper, the precise arrangement that had been quietly managed to keep those words buried, the full distance between what history recorded and what she had watched happen, she took every word of it. But the question that nobody who has studied this case can fully put down is the simplest one. Did she pull that trigger already knowing, with the cold certainty of a woman who had been balancing accounts since childhood, that the British Crown could not afford to let her hang? We will never know. But here is what the ledger shows. She was born with nothing in a city that consumed people who arrived with nothing. She spent her beauty precisely, her secrets strategically, and her silence with the patience of someone who understood that the right word withheld is worth more than 1,000 spoken too soon. She walked into a courtroom charged with murder. She walked out free. And the most powerful institution in the world quietly made sure the one thing that could explain why was never spoken aloud. The ledger she started in that one-room apartment in the 10th arrondissement finally closed in 1971. She had balanced the accounts. She had spent her beauty, her secrets, and her silence exactly when the cost of survival was highest. Marguerite Alibert didn't just survive the world that tried to eat her. She made it pay her way out.